Welcome to Metropolitan Community College's 15th Annual Diversity Matters film series. This is also the last International Intercultural Education virtual program of 2022. I want to especially thank audience members for your dedication to participate in these learning opportunities throughout the year of 2022. Your microphones and chat with other audience members are turned off. Please send your messages or questions for our discussion leader through the chat function to me, Cynthia Gooch Grayson. Also, watch the chat for important messages. The online evaluation link will be presented and you may win a copy of today's book, Native Presence and Sovereignty in College, Sustaining Indigenous Weapons to Defeat Systemic Monsters. Mr. Vernon Miller is a member of the Thunder Clan from the Omaha tribe of Nebraska and Iowa. He currently serves as the director of the Indigenous Center at Tufts University. He has a diverse professional background, including serving as the Residence Hall Director for the American Indian Program House at Cornell University and advisor to Native American Indigenous students at Cornell, and taught 6th through 12th grade business at Omaha Nation Public Schools. Vernon Miller completed a 3-term election to the Omaha Tribal Council in November of 2013 and in November 2014 elected as the tribal chairman of the Omaha tribe. He was a member of the Great Plains Chairmen's Association and the Great Plains Tribal Chairmen's Health Board. Vernon concurrently advised the Obama administration while serving on the Tribal Interior Budget Council for the U.S. Department of the Interior, the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration Tribal Technical Advisory Council, the National Institutes of Health Tribal Consultation Advisory Board, and the U.S. Health and Human Service Secretary's Tribal Advisory Committee. In addition, Miller sat on the executive board of the National Congress of American Indians and served as president of the Omaha Nation Public Schools Board of Education on the Omaha Indian Reservation. During Chairman Miller's tenure, he was able to lead his tribe to a unanimous decision in the U.S. Supreme Court, which upheld and prevented the diminishment of the Omaha Indian Reservation and substantiate that only an act of Congress could do so. Miller has also served as a National Race and Equity Healing Fellow with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation's Community Leadership Network, and America's for Indian Opportunity in 2010-2011 ambassador, and a 2016 fellow with the New Leaders Council, Omaha chapter. Vernon has been named Teacher of the Year by the National Indian Education Association, Advisor of the Year by the Nebraska Association of Student Councils, and the designation of a 40 under 40 by the National Center for the American Indian Enterprise Development, a prestigious award which recognizes 40 emerging American Indians from across Indian country who have demonstrated leadership, initiative, and dedication and made significant contributions in business and/or in their community. Miller received his Bachelor's of Science degree in secondary education from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln and his Master of Science in Counseling and Student Development at Kansas State University. It's noteworthy to mention that Vernon is a TRIO alum from Student Support Services and Upward Bound programs at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Please welcome Mr. Vernon Miller, who will share his thoughts on Amanda Tachine's book, Native Presence and Sovereignty in College, Sustaining Indigenous Weapons to Defeat Systemic Monsters. Mr. Miller.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone back home in Nebraska. I am in Boston, which is where Tufts University is, and so I am extremely blessed to be able to be the facilitator, leader in this discussion. This particular subject matter has a very, very special place for me and has impacted my journey significantly, both personally and professionally. And so, like Dr. Gooch mentioned, I am in Boston. I'm the director of the Indigenous Center at Tufts University. So Tufts has taken a really interesting approach as well as direction. Tufts, just so you're all aware, has around 10,500 students total. And so at Tufts specifically in Boston, we have 175 Indigenous students across Tufts wide, and that includes our med school, vet med school, or other professional schools. And then specifically undergrad students, we have 129 Indigenous students. And so I have the distinct pleasure to be able to help support the Indigenous students at Tufts. The only unfortunate thing is it's a one-person mission that I'm running right now because I'm the inaugural director. But Tufts has taken a very aggressive approach in being an institution in the Boston area, in the New England area, that wants to support and definitely help the Indigenous students impact their communities. And so that's kind of the work that I do, programming, support services, as well as advocacy for the Indigenous students and the community here. And Boston is unique because of the amount of colleges and universities that are out here. And so my journey, like I said, mentioned, I really, truly love education and teaching. And so that's what I went to school for in undergrad, and that's what I was able to do. But I am definitely an example of somebody you hear about teachers who get burnt out. I love my students in my community so much that I was doing everything. I was coaching, I was sponsoring, I was teaching, I was taking students to visit college campuses. And it just got so much of me that I couldn't do it anymore because I wasn't able to take care of myself. And so I thought I would just take 1 year off. I'll take a year off so I can recenter and do what I need to do so I can come back again. But, the creator had other plans for me. And so I ended up going into tribal government. And like, Dr. Gooch mentioned, joined the tribal council, became the chairman, was a school board president, and that just led to other opportunities of teaching. I still consider it teaching because I was educating others on the work that I was doing, our community's needs, our community's experiences, our students and our youth, what they needed help in advocating, because there was no one advocating at that time at a level that was needed. And then, when the re-election time came, I didn't get reelected, which is fine because that was a blessing, because then I got to really focus on myself. And I knew, because of, like you read in the book, I did not have, there was so many monsters there, and I didn't have the weapons yet to really understand how I would be able to face that. And I'm one of the students who didn't graduate in 4 years. It took me longer. And like, the story, I mean, this book was very, very impactful for me because it just really almost like told my story. And that's what I think a lot of, and when Dr. Tachine was writing, it's meant for Indigenous Native peoples. And so that's the biggest takeaway that I wanted to share, that's how it was able to draw me in. And so, like I said, I knew that I reflected on my journey as being a handful of Native students at the University of Nebraska. And at the time we had Helen Long Soldier, I don't know how she did it, because now I'm living that life and I know how overwhelming it can be now to be a one person, but like I said, that allowed me to reflect on what I wanted to do. I was going to go K-12 administration, be a principal or superintendent, but then I really thought about my journey in higher ed and how those monsters were there and how much they impacted my journey. And so I thought, when I was going to grad school even, and think about where I wanted to go, the very real systemic monster and battle that's out there is we are never represented in the curriculum. That's the biggest takeaway also. We're not represented in the curriculum. We're never represented in the faculty, and we're never represented in the other student body. And those experiences that we're going through, like it was mentioned at the very end of the book, it's something that we feel like you're doing that alone. And so that was another takeaway that I took from it as well. And so I chose that I wanted to do higher ed administration. So that's what I did. Went to Kansas State. Cornell provided an opportunity for me to continue right in grad school. They wanted me to come right away. So I had to finish grad school at Cornell. I did it on Zoom, before Zoom and the pandemic were a thing. So they allowed me to do that. And because of that, I stayed at Cornell for another 3 years. And then this opportunity became available because I knew that I really wanted to work with Native and Indigenous students and supporting them, to making sure they had the weapons and to making sure they had that resurgence that they needed to make it in their journeys. And so that's why I'm here at Boston. That's why I'm here at Tufts. That's why I'm here wanting to support Indigenous students. And I've really taken another journey, and just being here for the past 10 months, I was from a very Native American, Native centric mindset and mind process and critical thinking, that a lot of the Indigenous students, were very vocal. And I appreciate that with this generation, they're not afraid to self-advocate. And so a lot of the Indigenous students who weren't from, Turtle Island, North America, or what's known as the United States, they were from Guatemala, Ecuador, Mexico, the Caribbean, Afro-Indigenous students. And so they're vocalizing how they wanted, we have a center, How are we supporting them? How are we making sure they're included? And so for me, that's another takeaway of taking it to another level. If this is Native presence, how is the Indigenous presence going to be impacted? And so when I shared the Indigenous Center, that's one of the takeaways also, is it's really more inclusive of that. And so that's my journey. That's who I am. And that's kind of the mindset I had while reading the book. And so I'm going to share my screen just briefly, because as Native people, we're very visual learners, and maybe some of you are also. And so hopefully that also will help the discussion. So like I said, I'm excited we're all here. I don't want to spend my time talking the whole time. I want to hear from you all as well and have a healthy conversation. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen. So obviously the book itself, Native Presence and Sovereignty in College, I think the very key thing is sovereignty. What does that look like? Because you say sovereignty to tribal governments, that means that you're a sovereign nation. But in this regard, it's that individual, because we all do come, we're not a monolith. We're not coming from a pan-Indigenous or Native experience. Native students come from rural communities, reservations, come from urban areas, come from suburban areas. So it's something to always be mindful of when they talk about sovereignty. That's a takeaway there as well, is not every single Native person or Indigenous student you're going to work with or encounter or has been through the experience comes from a very monolithic experience. And so that's something to be very, very mindful. And sustaining the Indigenous weapons, how do we empower? How do we ensure that, they're using those weapons to really defeat the systemic monsters? And what I appreciate about the book is just calling them out, letting these are those monsters. These are what is providing those barriers and obstacles for what we're doing and what students are experiencing and so forth. So, and I'll name those monsters. There's the financial hardship monster, which we read about, the deficit or not enough monster, the failure monster, and the invisibility monster. The key thing is the in being in parentheses, and we'll talk more about that or have a conversation about that as we move on. The financial hardship monster, I'm just doing a brief summary. It has its roots in settler colonialism, which functions to maintain and reinforce impoverished conditions among Native peoples, which in turn threaten the dreams of attaining a college degree. And this book did a great job of going back into the very foundational educational history that in this country, what's known as US, and what that looked like in terms of, we can, as we all know, let's use capitalism and make money off of human beings. Let's say we're here to educate Native people so we can allocate money and went in depth on that. And we can do this. And even Harvard, who's down the road from us over here at Tufts, in their mission, they originally wrote that as well. And they created a building, that was supposed to house the Native students. But in that time frame they had it there, the book shared there was only 3 Native students that actually went there. So that's something, and that's because of that financial hardship, thinking about history from 1600 all the way up and what the economy looked like. Non-Indigenous people do not know before contact, before, Western quote unquote expansion happened, how, and on these lands, we already had our own economy. We had our own commerce. We had our own ability we were already engineers, we were already scientists, we were already farmers, we had all the systems already here, but because we were viewed, and it's not just here in the US, it's all over the world, Indigenous people are viewed as being of the lowest social class, and the doctrine of discovery is proof of that, and how you, when approaching societies or making decisions, how that's important. And so that, coming back to the financial hardship, we didn't use the same monetary, means that other, economies did. We had our own way of doing that. So that's, if that helps you also really understand a little bit more about the financial hardship and how that's a systemic now issue, and how, because of how the government really had eras of how they treated Indigenous people here, taking their land. The book goes great in talking about the Long Walk, the Trail of Tears, and what that meant in displacing Native people and using their land to create the colleges and universities that we're all sitting in, or we all know as. And so, and how there's never been, I like how she used, instead of repatriation, or, but using rematriation. And that was a great takeaway as well. And then the deficit not enough monster, also very similar to colonial. It is colonialism, but that having its roots in assimilating to whiteness. That was a federal policy that Andrew Jackson, the president here, had. Kill the Indian, save the man. Make them assimilated. It functions to occupy and maintain control of Indigenous minds, behaviors, and ways of life. We lost our languages through that. We lost our way of even like living. We were forced to adapt these skill sets. That was something that was very foreign to us, which in turn disrupts belonging to home, which is what they wanted. They wanted us not to feel home, which is taken with the land, not knowing that college is a possibility, and definitely that self-worth. And so one of the examples given in the book at the very beginning was the incident at Colorado State. Because we're visual learners, I wanted to show that to you, because it's one thing to read it, but to actually see now the Native students and what they experienced. It's a short video, I think 2 minutes long, but it really is that monster right there vividly, systemically, and how all these different parts are a part of that, from the parents to the law enforcement to the students, and now the reputation of that school. For a while, I was like, okay, I am not going to Colorado State. I will never encourage students to go there because of this experience. And I will just play it.
3 weeks after the controversial arrest of 2 African-American men at a Starbucks, another incident at Colorado State University is raising questions. 2 Native American teenagers say they were reported to the police because of their race. Nikki Batiste has the story.
Hey, put your hand in your pocket, please. Thanks.
A questioning and pat down by police is not what these brothers expected when they signed up for a campus tour at Colorado State University. But a mother on their tour called campus police and said Thomas and Lloyd Gray, who joined the group late, were wearing strange clothing and made her feel sick.
One of them has their left hand in his oversized sweatshirt the whole time. It's probably nothing. I'm probably being completely paranoid with just everything that's happened. They're probably fine with just creepy kids. Are they white males? I think they're Hispanic, I believe.
According to the police report, the caller, a white female, told police the 2 boys, who are Native American, were laughing and keeping to themselves and did not seem to be interested in the tour. After showing the campus police an email confirmation for the tour, they were let go. That's when they called their mother, Lorraine Gray.
Then I get a frantic phone call from Thomas saying, somebody called the police on us because we were quiet.
According to the police report, Lorraine then called CSU and said she was upset and felt that her boys were being racially profiled. She says her son Thomas, a musician, dreamed of going to Colorado State University, and now she has a few words for the woman who called police.
I hope this never happens to your child. And I hope that you learn a lesson about judging a book by its cover.
Colorado State University's president said in a statement that people of all races, religions, gender identities, and appearances belong here. The school says it has reached out to the boys and their mother to offer a VIP campus tour. But so far, Rena, the university says the family has not responded. Okay, Nikki Batiste, thank you very much, Nikki.
So that, like I said, that monster alone, not enough, definitely is, through that example, is something that the students that you may have, maybe if you're a student yourself, you've experienced some type of monster like this on your journey. And some of your students, we do a great job of not sharing this because we don't know how to share these experiences, because we grew up very collectively. So that's something that, that video really brought to a reality, and triggering sometimes, because the experiences that our Native students are having, the reality, like I shared earlier, is that education in itself is not a system that we were meant to be part of, and that's another example of that systemic monster that's there. The third monster is a failure monster. Began when the settlers stamped us as failures on their meritocratic and capitalist terms, and the system still applies that failure stamp with a heavy hand. The failure monster teaches us that these influences have created legacies of the ideological convergence. We talked about that read about that pathologize and stamp failure on our people by turning the mirror away from itself towards us. So because of that, there's a capital investment in the ideological convergence and the retelling of Native peoples as failures. Like I said, we were thriving. We were thriving for centuries before colonials came over here. And so the failure monster is clever in that it's glorified structure of conquest, individualism, hierarchy, and paternalism has pervasively seeped into today's culture, university systems, and students. And that's on page 128. And that was a takeaway that I really took from that particular monster itself, and how that systemic attitude and mentality has really impacted Native and Indigenous students. And then the other one is the invisibility monster. It has roots in erasure and racism that work to dehumanize and erase our multitude of brilliance and intellect, which in turn sets up to question who we are and our sense of belonging, and unsettle the connections we have to our home and lands. So those are the four monsters. I'm gonna take it back to that original slide, those four there. I'm gonna go ahead and see if there's any questions or if there's any lingering thoughts that anybody has here. About those, or about what their takeaways were from those four monsters. Is there anybody? Dr. Gooch, if you want to take away to moderate that part of it, and I'll put the
Sure.
monsters in the chat.
Okay, thank you, Vernon. You all can send me your questions or comments and I'll read them. And while you're sending those to me, Vernon, because I've known you for such a long time, and during your undergraduate career, I want to know which of those monsters was more prevalent with you as a student at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level.
The overwhelming one was definitely the financial hardship monster. You know, people know I don't share this story often, but I was working 3 jobs, you know, towards the end of my undergrad career, because yes, I had a Pell Grant, but I lost it after a year because it was just those different monsters that were there were impacting my experience. And so I lost the Pell Grant. I was put on academic probation, but I overcame that, you know, on my own resurgence, which is a weapon that we read about. And so but towards the end of my last 2 years of undergrad, I was working at Home Depot because I had, at the time, they offered 50% tuition reimbursement. So they were able to pay for half of that. I was working at a bar across the street, Brewski's, I think it's still there in Lincoln. I was a keynote writer because I got a free meal. And so that was an opportunity for me to overcome. Whenever I worked there, I would always make sure I get a free meal. And then I also worked at a hotel because that's a great place to study. And I always tell students, you want a place to study, you want to get paid for it. I worked at a hotel and I loved it. And it allowed me, like I said, those 3 jobs to be able to sustain myself. I didn't have the ability to pay for the housing. And so I lived with 7 other guys to make it as cheap as possible. But the financial hardship was definitely something that was very prevalent throughout my experience, because, you know, I love my parents, you know, but, you know, because like I was first gen, obviously trio, you know, they didn't have the experience of going to college also. And so didn't know that the intergenerational wealth concept was a thing. You were, you know, because they didn't know to put money away, didn't know we should be investing in this way. And so that was the biggest one for me. That's just me personally. So.
Thank you for sharing. I do have a question that came in the chat. Please continue to send them our way. So one question is, when I see the CSU video, it is easy to see what the individual could have done differently, but I'm wondering, what are some things CSU could have done differently also? Actually, Kathy Trotter and I were going back and forth with what they should have done, but our opinions. But Vernon, go ahead.
I think what the one of the takeaways initially from the mother is, you know, this monolith of, you know, and Native people who they are expecting, you know, just because a student's shy, you know, because I was a teacher, I was fortunate that all my students had very different personalities, which I loved. You know, they had very different experiences also. What I took away, these students saved money to go on that trip. Going to Colorado State, it was something they wanted to go to, but it wasn't a place that had ever been. They didn't know what to ask. They didn't know what that experience was going to be like to be on a college tour like that. And, you know, because of this person's expectation, you know, talking about those systemic monsters, you know, especially that invisibility monster, you know, not knowing that, you know, Native students aren't going to have long hair, all have long hair. They're not going to be dressed a certain way. They're not going to be, you know, and so these students were very unique. To them, they were quote unquote creepy. For me, law enforcement really should have checked on the students. You know, these are minors, you know, and said, "Are you okay? How are you feeling?" I didn't see any of that mentioned at all. That would have been the first thing. And I've already experienced that here at Tufts with some students that had an incident, and I was like, the law enforcement came in immediately and they just went straight into disciplinary mode rather than, you know, saying, "Are you all okay?" You know, we set the fire alarm off because we were we're blessed. We're doing a little ceremony, which we have permission to do from the fire marshal. But they came in and said, I know you guys are smoking something in because I can smell it, and so the students just were very, like I said, so for me, it would have been checking on the students. They're minors, we want to make sure they're okay. And that's our job, is to protect, first of all. And then after they're okay, then say, well, what is the issue here? And then went from there. But that's my personal opinion. They should have really checked on the students initially, because you notice they left right away. I would have left too,
Oh, yeah.
after that traumatic experience. So
Right. Yeah, I agree, and I think they should have, the campus, I just knew they were gonna say, "Oh, free tuition," right? But they offered a do-over for a campus tour. I'm like, no, they missed that. Amanda Tachine is Navajo, and many Navajo teachings are woven throughout the reading. What components of the learning do you believe would be similar for most Native students from any tribal affiliation?
I think Amanda's approach was very, like I said, she was writing it for Native people, and the rug, specifically, is a very Navajo specific, art and cultural aspect. And so I know how that's regarded, for other tribal communities. It could be, it's going to be other items. It could be beading, it could be in the Northeast, they do different things with hides, or you even see some things where in the Northwest or in Alaska Native communities using the animals in different ways, and making sure it's all fully used. But for me, it's the interweaving of, it's living in two worlds, like Dr. Tachine talked about in the book, towards the end. How do we take this, very settler colonial way of educating and learning? That is one concept. But for us, like I said, when we learn our language, it's done through our elders and our ancestors who are now gone. They had their own unique way of transferring that knowledge down. And that's a value, that ability to redistribute that knowledge that you hold and redistribute that. And that comes through various ways, whether it's fasting, whether it's, like I said, using it through art and textiles, or whether that's in having just conversations, or just the general life skills that are taught to youth, and what that looks like. And so a lot of that comes from language. And so I love the language aspect that was also in the book throughout. And so when I was a teacher, I would always try to interweave language in my whatever I can do. And so for me, that's my takeaway from that experience is it's very Navajo specific, but I was able to find the relevance, in what I did, through, like I said, how I taught. And, as a teacher, you should always make sure what you're doing is relevant. And that's what Dr. Tachine did, but is also engaging, because as a teacher, when your students aren't interested, when they're not wanting to learn. There's something going on, whether it's at home, or maybe it's on how it's being taught. Maybe they're at another level. I talked about also how the rigor wasn't rigorous enough, the curriculum, the education. And so I loved how they were able to call that out. And that's a reality for a lot of students from Native communities, how they're just not challenged. And I experienced that with the students that I engage with and how they perceive school. So yeah, that's kind of what I took away from that weaving part of it. So
thank you for that response. So Vernon, do you believe that Native American students are better able to overcome these monsters if there's a Native American center on campus, or a multicultural center like you experienced, or groups like Unite that you experienced? And right now you're leading the Native American Center at TUFTS, and you led a similar residence hall at Cornell, correct? So can you speak to that? Do those institutions within an institution, or organizations within an institution, help with the retention, graduation, and overcoming of said monsters?
So I've not been here for a full year at Tufts, but I can answer about Cornell. So that residence hall was built a little over 30 years ago. It's going to be celebrating 30 years this year. And it's the first residence hall for Indigenous Native students in the entire country. And so that institution, but there's also a lot of past that you won't hear about sometimes at Cornell, about Morrill Hall, the Morrill Act, and how Cornell was actually a pretty big part of that, of the land grab. And so Sure, there's historical things that have happened, but more recently, because they're located geographically, people don't know this, but Cornell is actually the land grant institution for the state of New York, and so because of that, there's a different level of expectation that universities have when they're in that role, and so having a stronger Native community in terms of the sovereignty that's expressed through those 6 tribal nations in New York. They really created the space for when Native students came to campus. They knew that it's not just a building. If you want to Google it, it's a very interesting, unique spelling, but it's spelled like this, Aguego with the colon, but it looks like Aquacon. And a lot of people, when they visit a campus, oh, you live in Aquacon? It's like, no, it's actually Aguego. The K's become a G sound. So what it is like I said, it's a residence hall for 35 Native students. And the architecture of the building is very specific to the tribal nations in New York. The curriculum, the model of programming involving clan mothers from the communities coming down to visit. Lacrosse has a huge, influence out in the Northeast, and in New York with the tribal communities. And so just having that level of engagement was very impactful for the students, and be able to be together in community, and having a physical space to do that in, not having a multicultural center, not having a room dedicated, but having an actual residence hall, has been impactful. And but I've also seen how it's shifted, you know what I mean? Because as I was leaving Cornell, the numbers weren't where we would want them to be. They were there, they just weren't staying in the residence hall, because there was this monster that was there, that the invisibility monster, saying you should have a stereotypical first-year freshman experience. And to get that, you need to live in a non-Indigenous, non-Native space. And so when we would put students there, they're like, I want out. I want to live here. I want to have this experience. Because that was being promoted, on social media. That's being promoted in others, that in order to have this college experience, you need to do it in that realm, and that level of engagement outside of that space. And so we saw that shift. There were still students there, but the students that were there had to have a level of wanting to learn more about Indigenous communities and cultures. And so by having that space, like I said, over 30 years, shows that the commitment that's there from the university, shows the resurgence and resilience of the students, and how they give back on giving days, or always making sure that building is maintained, is continually going to be there in 30 years from now. Coming now to where I am today, the center here, the Indigenous Center at Tufts, was truly a result of student advocacy. They noticed an uptick of students that are coming here. The other identity centers, we have 8 identity centers. We have an Africana Center, Latinx Center, LGBT Center, Asian American Center, First Center, Center for STEM Diversity, Women's Center, and now the Indigenous Center is our newest identity center. And we're all 8 different physical buildings, which I love. I never understood that until I got at Tufts, that we don't want a multicultural center. We want our communities to have their own physical spaces that can center their experiences, their identities, their history, and really allow them to just be not just safe, but brave in learning who they want to be. And so being at Tufts, and I started, when I hired me in February, they wanted me to start before the semester ended. They wanted the center to be as functioning as it could. And so I came on board. My first day was March 2nd. That was also an open house. But there were so many community members that were here, at the Indigenous students that came, because this was their reality, that we now have a space, and to see that level of enthusiasm. If it gives you any indication of how it's growing, we had 3 Native students that graduated in May, and are entering freshman first year class. We now have over 53 Native students that are in this freshman class. So you see that level of growth from 3 to now 53. And so next year, we're hoping that number, and we're anticipating that number is going to double again. And so you see that level of growth. And like I said, there's some things that Admissions Tufts has done to be more aggressive in specifically using QuestBridge as an opportunity to get Native students here. The recruitment, we'd never had somebody who was committed to the Indigenous experience. And so they sent me out recruiting. I went to 4 different states and communities. In January, I'm going out again to do some work, to really, and the thing is, you can't just go to a school and expect them to be able to want to come to your community. you have to establish those relationships. You have to be able to be present. They have to establish that trust, but they also have, like, the representation matters, that invisibility. They have to see themselves there. And they have to understand that. And so for me at Tufts, which is even more unique, we don't have any Native students or Indigenous students from the New England area. The furthest place we have is Connecticut. And so to me, I'm like, wait a minute, we have a tribal community, the Mashpee Wampanoag, who are on Cape Cod, just miles down the road, but there's never been any students. I've talked to the community. We've never had students go to Harvard. We've never had students go to Tufts, MIT. They go to UMass Boston, UMass Amherst. So for me, the students and I have been really slowly trying to create a presence. We go to the Indian Center. They had a back to school supply drive. We donated items from Tufts just so they can start seeing us. I took my direction from Dr. Gooch and admissions. And so we're going to have a Native American visit day coming up soon to really just allow them to see the space, to know the space, and to see the Indigenous students here. Because if they see the other students here, we have a center, they're going to know it's a space they want to be part of. And they know that there's going to be support here for them. So what I've seen over the 10 months now is, especially today, is how the students have really embraced the center, how it's become a home away from home for them. And they all share that understanding of what the space is. They're very respectful of the space. Like I'm able to offer it 24/7 the hours to them. They request key card access and they can come in past 5 or 6 p.m. It's a totally different experience here from 9 to 5 when I'm here than it is from 5 to like midnight, because it just comes to life after hours. Because the students are using it. We have a full functioning kitchen. If we have food insecurity is very real, and we touched about it briefly in the book. But the students can come here. They can make sure that they have something to eat. They can make something on their own. They have a space that's theirs, and something they can be proud of. And so I think that the pride thing is a huge thing. But I only see it growing and flourishing from this point on. So.
Thank you, Vernon. I want to give a shout out to Deborah Grant, who is in the Zoom room. She knows you, Vernon. She's very proud. Same tribal affiliation. She's very proud of all of your accomplishments, and stated that she also had the hardship of the financial hardship monster. Even though your tribe has a higher education program, she says she was in college and the courses were by quarter, so she always missed the deadlines on receiving any assistance from the tribe. So after her Pell ran out, she had to go to work to assist with her schooling. So thank you again, Deborah, for sharing. I do want to pivot and talk about the Navajo twin warriors in the book. From your experience, how do Native students rely on traditional stories to help them travel through life?
I think this being able to share that story too has been helpful. But every community has creation stories, Indigenous community specifically. But it's not something that's written down because of how colonialism works and how appropriation works and how those are definitely appropriated something else. And so it's passed down oratory. And so for me, the takeaway there is that Indigenous knowledge, the medicine, the stories, the songs, the language, the clan system, the kinship, that was an important takeaway from the twin warriors, and how that's that resurgence, that's those weapons that those twins were able to acquire from the different, places that they encountered on that journey. And so for me, it's also just reminding the students of the values that we hold. That's the takeaway from there in terms of how do we make that something that the students can tangibly understand, the value of respect, respecting not just one another, but also respecting the spaces that we're in, the physical spaces, we understand, okay, especially at the universities and colleges that we're on, those were Indigenous lands, Native lands. And so do you respect beyond the land acknowledgement of calling it out, but also like, what are you doing also to preserve it? There's a lot of environmental climate change things that are happening now that we can see. So not only respecting the land, respecting the beings, respecting others, we're not just living here as humans alone. There's animals, there's insects, there's the plants, there's medicines that are alive around us. And so respecting that and understanding the relationship that you hold. And those relationships, they're not just with, kinship, but it's also when you're away, like the story talked about, you develop relationships and those friends become family to you. And especially from Indigenous communities, because we're a collective society, the students I work with, a lot of them call me uncle now rather than Vernon. And this generation has a unique way. They start calling you other things too. Like somebody come, hey, hi, babe, hi, best friend. And I'm like, no, I'm Vernon. And, and that's this generation. I saw a lot of TikTok videos that were saying that's how they just greet each other. And I'm like, I'm glad you're doing that. But, so it's understanding that level also, of those relationships and what they look like. When I was at another institution and how I was engaging with Native students, it was a non-Native person saying, you really shouldn't be teasing that way. And as a Native person, that's kind of how you build trust in relationships. If you're not being teased, there's probably something wrong there with another Native person. And so that's just how, if the students know that I'm comfortable, that I'm able to tease like that, and I'll take it back. But that's just our way of being resilient, and our way of showing that that's our quote unquote love language from a Western approach, is that's just kind of one way that we show that to one another. And so a non-Native person from another country was trying to say, no, you shouldn't be communicating that way. And I was like, okay, red flag, no. As a Native person who has a degree in higher ed, this is what I'm telling you how it works. And the book definitely showed that, in those weapons of what they look like, and they look different. And like, 'cause they're not a monolith. I know. So for me, that's kind of from those stories, and that redistribution, that's another value that we all hold. Sure, we're here getting this knowledge and we're having this experience, but we're not here alone. We're here through our family. We're here through our nation. And so we're going home to redistribute that knowledge. And Dr. Tachine talked about that in the book, about how, it's a sacrifice that not only our fams and our villages and our communities are making for us to come back and redistribute that, and to be able to help mentor others, and hopefully improve the quality of life. We heard so many stories from the 10 students on what they were overcoming, the inaccess to water, the inaccess to electricity, what that looks like for them. And for some of us, we've never had to experience that, but I've heard stories from my grandparents who lived that life, and what it was like. And so, that's something that's a takeaway also, is passing down that experience. Because if you don't ever know that, you're never going to know what that struggle was like. So yeah, you're not going to have that same value that we all should be having, and we all should be learning. And so, I don't know, that's kind of my takeaway from the stories, but also community wise, that's what I try to teach, is remember our values, remember what you're doing here, remember your purpose, but we're just blessed to have a space where I can do that with the students. Like I said, I don't think I had that completely, because all Helen had at UNL was an office, a small little office, with one small 2-seater couch. Not all of us could be there at one time. We had to take shifts and going in there, but she was very welcoming and very open to having us here. And so, but having a center definitely has impacted the ability to do that bigger and more, and just providing a space for Native students to come has been helpful.
Thank you. You touched on this a little bit. Please advise how non-Natives should show honor and respect when working with students for whom traditional life and teachings are a guiding force. And have you seen conflicts with traditional teachings play out in educational institutions?
That is a great question. And I'm going to refer you to page 177 in the book, because it specifically answers that question from the book reading. And when I read that, I really it was a reminder to me of, the most recent experience I had, where I came to the center here at Tufts with a very Native American centric experience and mindset. And so changing that and being mindful of Indigenous, how am I making this space so it's inclusive? We had a ofrenda during the whole month of October, because there's a lot of Indigenous ties to that. And so the students having a space to have that, remembering their ancestors. I have never experienced Dia de los Muertos. I've never experienced what that was like. And so to be in community with the students, they completely created the ofrenda. We had it all month. And they shared a lot of history. One of the students from Mexico, we had sugar skulls, and we can't have sugar skulls. And they shared why, and I was like, okay, now I know. Like I said, I came from a very, whatever I saw in media. And I didn't have a lot of, friends who wanted to share that part of their lives with me, because Nebraska is a very white space, and I wasn't able to experience it like I wanted to. So for me, like I said, just being very much, after reading that, understanding how can I make sure, like as a teacher, am I making their experience relevant for them, and how I make it engaging so they can be in community with one another and experience that together and learn from one another, because there's so many Indigenous communities and experiences and histories, to be able to share that, like the language, like a lot of the students who were speaking Spanish were just sharing how when you say this word, it means this in the Dominican, and it means this totally different over here in Puerto Rico, which are really close. So I don't know. So just listening to the language part of it too. I learned from one of our students who's here from South Dakota, we have the same word for money, Mozeska, and that's how they say it also in her tribe in Rosebud. And so I was like, wow, like there's some of those ties that are there that we wouldn't think of. And so that's kind of my takeaway from that, as how making sure it's relevant and making sure it's engaging, but also just listening. Like you have to listen to the students. If they're telling you why they don't want it done this way, don't do it. Ask them to be a part of that, but also don't make them the people doing it. You know, they're already trying to make it through college or higher education. Adding this another level of, can you cook fry bread today? Or can you cook a traditional soup? You're asking a lot already. And so just be mindful of that. And her takeaways on a brief note to teachers, professors, administrators, and policymakers. And then they listed, you know, and we'll show it at the end, the 8 declarations. Those are how you can support. Those are how you can be allies. Those are different ways that you can definitely consider when working with Native communities.
Thank you. I got some more questions. Can you talk about the author's description of hauntings, and how can our audience recognize hauntings to help reduce the incidents, trauma for Native students and colleagues alike?
Calling it out, you know, I did a talk a few weeks ago with the American Indian College Fund, which has changed our name now to Native Scholars Forward. And I called it out, white fragility, because that's what a lot of my experiences have been as a Native person, Indigenous person in higher ed specifically. Sure, there's well-meaning, quote unquote, individuals who want to do things, who want to, you know, have this ceremony, have this experience. But if a Native person or Indigenous person is telling you why it shouldn't happen in the future or why they're not going to be there, listen to that and understand why, because you're just those are hauntings you're just reinforcing. And so just be mindful of what impact, the intent and the impact, you know, what that conversation is, because you could really, you know, create another systemic haunting for a student who's just trying to survive. And I want to say thrive, but if those hauntings are already there and you're adding more, you know, that's going to be another reason why they maybe want to consider transferring or maybe consider going to a different experience, you know. And look at the monsters. Those are very key into those hauntings, because those are what are haunting those students. I talked about the financial one for me, the financial hardship. That's a reality for students. The invisibility is a key one. If look at your faculty at your institution, look at the staff, administrators. Do they reflect the students? Do they reflect the region? You know, and look at the curriculum. You know, the biggest thing that I love the students at Cornell for is we were building brand new residence halls, and one of the buildings they wanted to put right next to a Grego was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's an alum of Cornell. They wanted to put her building right next to Aguego. And the students were like, oh, no, we cannot, time out. No, we're not going to do this. Because people don't know, yeah, she did great things for female identifying, for women's rights, but people don't understand when she was on the Supreme Court, when anything came up with Native people, she would always refer to the doctrine of discovery as her basis for making decisions. And if you look at what that is, you're going to understand why we as Native people did not really hold her to the regard that others did. And the students were very vocal. You would not put this hall here. So they put it on the other side of our residential campus, and they vocalized that. So they took that haunting and made it a weapon, you know. So just be very mindful of what you're doing systemically, what those are. Look at the monsters, and they give specific examples of how those are haunting the students. So that's my takeaway from those is, you know, really consider what's being reinforced. You know, I've learned a whole new concept of Thanksgiving since being out here alone just this year because of where I'm at geographically. You know, I went to Plymouth Rock, National Day of Mourning. I took students there. So one of the students even spoke, and I was just like, you know, they have those weapons and they have those ability to not let that holiday be a haunting for them and to make it an opportunity for them to thrive. So just be mindful of, you know, from those monsters, what that looks like for your experience and what you're quote unquote reinforcing and making a haunting for the students.
A video viewed of Tachine, she speaks of not being able to tell the Navajo twin warrior story because it was the wrong season. We've also heard storytellers from the Omaha tribe state the same. Can you help us understand that, what that means?
Also, it's one thing season, sure. But it's also, like, for example, a biggest thing for being Omaha is the Gregorian New Year starts on January 1st. For us, not just Omaha, but a lot of other tribal communities, the New Year starts on the first thunder in the spring. because that's when things are being reborn, things are becoming to life again. The animals are having babies again. That's when our new year starts, and that's typically in April when you hear that first thunder. And so and that story gets told seasonally around that time of the year. And I remember sharing that story when I was in New York with another Indigenous person. They're like, we have that same story. And I am Seneca, and that's the way that we function also, and how we, seasonality and how we do things. One of the more interesting, histories about our powwow, our heteropatriarchy in Nebraska and Omaha is it just celebrated its 218th year. People don't realize it's actually way older than that. But the only reason, when you think about this settler colonial mindset now, how the white man stamp of approval, that was also in here, how 218 years ago is when Lewis and Clark came through our area. They documented that happening. They documented Omaha's having this harvest celebration. And so that's the only reason why it has this number next to it, is that's when Lewis and Clark decided that they would document it, and that's why it's documented that way. So just being mindful of seasonality, but we've always had our heteropatriarchy or our powwow whenever the full moon in August occurs, because that's when we know it's seasonally time to change, time to get ready for the harvest, get ready for the colder months that are about to happen. But that's the only reason why it has a number next to it, is because of Lewis and Clark when they came through. So with the warrior stories, being mindful of, creation wise, there's a lot of astrological things that are also there, but things that are happening right now in winter, we have finally had our first snowfall in our area a couple of days ago. But in some communities, they'll take the babies out and have their first bath, and that's a very symbolic event that happens. So that's kind of a takeaway from the creation story also with the warriors. And so if that helps you also, something more locally, regionally, and how it happens nationally with different people.
Thank you. Would hauntings be the equivalency of microaggressions to you?
Oh, definitely. Almost macro even too. So
Yeah, I was thinking larger.
Mhm.
Thank you. Folks, we have time for about two more questions.
I will, while you get questions, I'm going to show another video.
Okay.
I don't want to end on hauntings. I don't want to end on
Thank you, Bird.
There are opportunities. Yeah, when you take those weapons, and you understand how to use those to strive, to thrive. So I'm gonna show a video. It's on Netflix. It's called Basketball or Nothing. This is an experience where it talks about these weapons and how this person had a native coach and a teacher. They applied, we heard Big State University in the book, which is U of A, but another school in Arizona is NAU, but also Arizona State. And so this student, taking these weapons and taking this experience in Munsters, they had a financial hardship in Munster. They couldn't afford college. So they thought basketball was their way to do it. They didn't get any basketball scholarships. So they found other ways to use weapons. So that's just a brief synopsis. And I'll let you see kind of how the student is able to now take those. So let me share my screen, and hopefully that'll give you some time to get some more questions. And it's only a couple minutes long also. So from the book, page 129, talking about the twin warriors, the twins were taught holy prayers and songs that protected them along their journey. Similarly, while students were confronted by the failure monster, they engaged the third indigenous weapons of reverence. And that's what that video very much illustrated. The act of believing, or an ability to get through, that is grounded in a deep awareness of and connection to divineness, which is practiced through prayer. Reverence is sacredness, centered and protects and sustains kinship and is very relationship based in the present and the future. Resurgence helps to rise. Continuance helps us to keep going. Reverence helps us to get through. And so the takeaway there is, he showed, reverence and how that's going to be part of their journey. And so you have to breathe that in 4 times and for it to become a part of who you are and your being on your journey. And so I just wanted to share that moment because that was something that I took away from the book that really summed up my takeaways from it. But I'll leave it for last questions that we have. So.
That was amazing, Vernon. Thank you for sharing that clip. I don't know. I saw a couple of tears falling on their desk and people covering up their faces. Kathy, I think Mr. Sherman and Deborah sent me a message. Cindy. Also, you being Upward Bound Math Science. For those that didn't catch it, Vernon is an Upward Bound alumni from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, SSS Trio alumni, University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Peacock proud, elephant elated of all the things that you have done and continue to do, Vernon. You rep our state well. And also, rather than take a question, I would like for you to give final moment of inspiration and encouragement to us.
I think for me, it's, just always remember to reflect and always remember to take lessons and to take those experiences that we have and really embrace those, because sure, they may have been challenging. They may have been traumatic, but it's what you take from those that are going to impact what it is for you. I didn't realize the amount of trauma I had when I was going through undergrad. Back then, I think we shared earlier, some of you may have missed it, but like Higher Learning was a movie that had just come out back when I started undergrad. And I was like, when I walk across campus in Lincoln, am I going to meet a skinhead? And is somebody going to be like wanting to do all this? And so I didn't have a lot of trust in different people for a while. So just know from a Native student, Indigenous student perspective, the monsters that are there for them, and their weapons, they may not even know that they're there yet. And so be mindful of how can you help them. Please don't be a savior in any way of knowing that I'm going to come in and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Know that, we as educators, we have to help them develop those skill sets of being independent, of being able to thrive on their own. And so take it from that approach rather than what can you do to save them right now? Let me buy this from, let me buy that. No, how can I teach them? It's that saying goes, you can teach a person, you can take them, you can give them a fish, or you can teach them how to fish, same concept. So for me, it's just being mindful of the communities that are in, the people, the land that you're on, what values do you hold? I always proudly tell people we're actually all more Indigenous than we realize, because we all come from different places and spaces. So just remember what your values are and what impact you have, and just be thankful for those that are in your lives today, because you never know when they could leave. But remember the lessons that you take from them as well. So, but thank you all very much. I'm blessed that I have a relationship with Dr. Gooch to be able to do this today. And so thank you all very much.
Thank you, Vernon. Thank you. The Sydney, our tech, who's today's her first day doing this, I think, for us. One of her first days. She was like, how long have y'all known each other? A long, long time. But Vernon, how rewarding to have you lead this discussion for Metropolitan Community College today at this time. Thank you so much for your involvement throughout the years, not just today, but as a friend to the college, and your determination to impact others. I suspect you are similar to the reports of the students in this book, whose overall goal was to make a difference for others and their communities. Audience members, if you have not read Native Presence and Sovereignty in College yet, please consider seeking a copy out at Metropolitan Community College's libraries. I see Mr. Antonio Tiller is here from our libraries. And as a reminder, we will appreciate your feedback on the online evaluation address, which has been posted in the chat. We offer over 50 virtual programs in an academic year. If you participate in at least 20, and you complete the evaluations and identify yourself with your contact information, you will be recognized. Today, I am happy to announce that the 38th annual Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. celebration offers you the opportunity to attend live in person at the historic Fort Omaha campus, Building 22, Room 201 for $15. Or you may connect free via Zoom. Kevin Powell, writer, activist, and television personality, will be the keynote speaker. Registration information is in the chat and will be emailed to the attendees. Also, now is the perfect time to prepare for the next Diversity Matters book discussion, especially with the recess that we'll have beginning next week. The Last Slave Ship, written by Ben Raines, will be presented with a discussion led by Mrs. Brenda Magruder, retired from Omaha Public Schools, on Thursday, January 19th at 6:30 p.m. Mrs. Magruder calls the book an easy read, so I hope you can enjoy exploring it over the holiday season. Today, you could have been many places, and we're grateful that you took time to be in this space with us. Thank you all for attending.